In this lesson, we're going to talk specifically about treatment of religious addiction. There's nothing magical or powerful about religious addiction. That's the mind game religious addicts play. They throw up that smoke screen of the sanctity of the religious beliefs in order to avoid taking responsibility for their lives. So religious addicts are seeking a fix out there that's going to make them better, just like other addicts. So treating religious addicts simply requires that you just guide those patients out of the shame and the victimhood into this re-empowerment, that you move them from a passive codependency that says, fix me, God, to this responsible, creative relationship. If you treat any kind of addiction, you can treat religious addiction and abuse because it too is an escape from feelings of, a flight from self. If you treat codependency and dysfunctional relationships, you can treat religious addiction and abuse because it's the ultimate dysfunctional relationship. If you treat shame and self-hate, then you can treat religious addiction and abuse because it's the deepest core of all shame and self-hate issues. The key to treating religious addiction is in learning to connect the symptoms with the core issues that are the most common to most addictions, and then using the various therapeutic techniques for addressing those issues. Because healthy spirituality requires mental, emotional, and physical well-being, if you're addressing those three needs in your therapies, then you're on your way to developing a program that enhances your patient's spiritual growth. Probably the most challenging task in working with the religiously addicted patient lies in opening the patient to the idea of a spirituality that's separate from and even transcends religion. Religion is created by human beings. Spirituality is God-given. Spirituality is being a positive and creative human being. Religion may be a tool one uses to develop positive creativity, but just being religious and following the rules is not the same as being spiritual. Patients might even be in denial and they could resist this concept, insisting that there is nothing compulsive about their relationship with God or the church. You're likely to be met with this wall of scripture and dogma. Ignore it. Don't buy into it. Imagine a drug-addicted person shooting up and ask what the patient is feeling, why the patient is medicating. Begin to explore as quickly as possible those sources of guilt and shame that have no doubt propelled the patient into religious addiction. Using a few of the symptoms of religious addiction as if they were presenting during the course of an intake or a psychosocial evaluation, I've listed some of the issues they represent and some treatment goals for addressing those issues as they might appear in your assessments. The full list is located in the course lesson as a handout. I've just put the first three here. Of course, the list that I've provided for you is by no means including all of the issues. And there are going to be other treatment goals. So as you begin to identify religious addiction and abuse issues, you're likely to discover how those issues are tied into larger issues of control or enmeshment, caretaking, triangulation, and other aspects of codependency, as well as images or issues of their body image or sexual identity and dysfunction. And so as you can see from the chart, religious addiction creates many of those same issues as other addictions. So the treatment goals are basically the same. And you'll notice that very few of them specifically address God or religion or spirituality, except in those terms of creating a structure, defining abstinence, and enhancing spirituality. Because like food addicts and sex addicts, religiously addicted patients are going to need assistance in creating a structure within which the use of religion can be balanced and healthy. They're going to also need some cognitive work on the difference between spirituality and religion, especially as it applies to the 12-step programs. A lot of these patients go through treatment or therapy without addressing their religious abuse issues, mostly because nobody thinks to look for them or recognizes their significance. And we must also seek out the nature of the religious messages or belief systems patients were given in their childhood. Psychiatrist M. Scott Peck says that the actual dysfunctional messages, as well as the ways in which parental behavior reflected or contradicted those messages, are going to shape how a person is going to see the world. So it's critical to spend some time in the initial intake exploring the complete belief system with which a person was raised, in addition to the behavior of parents and significant adults in that patient's childhood. In most cases, the tools for gathering information about the addict's worldview are already there, they're already in place. A lot of therapists and treatment centers already include genograms in or with the psychosocial assessment. So when you're tracing the patterns of addiction through a patient's family of origin, you want to ask about their religious behavior in the same way that you would ask about alcohol or drugs. So if dad was rigid and strict, you might want to ask if he was very religious or if his parents were. How did he manifest his religiosity? Was he angry and judging? Was he emotionally and physically absent? Did mom spend all her time at mass or saying prayers, or was she totally absorbed in her church duties? How did the patient feel about their parents' behaviors? And since you're looking for sources of guilt and shame and low self-esteem, you might want to ask about the sexual messages that the patient received growing up too. Does the patient feel that sex is dirty? Where did they learn that? Was it taught in school or somehow validated or confirmed by their religious teachings? Patients that are struggling to come to terms with their homosexuality will often have major issues around religion. So ask about them. If a woman seems to have an ingrained sense of inferiority, who other than her dysfunctional family told her that she was second rate? If the patient was Catholic and attended some sort of Catholic school, ask about the priests and the nuns. Were they physically or emotionally abusive? Was the patient subjected to constant humiliation and shaming messages at school? What threats accompanied those religious teachings? What fears did the patient grow up with as a result of the religious messages received, either in the home or through Sunday school? Dysfunctional religious messages can really contribute to unresolved grief and loss issues. Children are often told it's selfish to mourn a death because their loved one is in heaven. And added to that unresolved grief is the guilt that they carry for even having grieved in the first place. And adults simply might not permit themselves to grieve because of the religious messages about the hereafter, or else they feel guilty about the grieving. And you're often going to need to lead those patients through a tangle of abusive and dysfunctional messages as you help them uncover and reframe those early teachings that they received about why they feel it's bad to grieve. You might also find this general tendency to minimize or discount illness or trauma, as well as a deep-seated inability to trust anybody outside of their faith or their culture. Those issues can have, and usually do have, a really great impact on the survivors and on the children who were raised by these guilt-ridden parents. So ask. You might be amazed at the response. Frequently, patients have never really thought about the religious messages they received as having been abusive or contributing to their shame and their inability to accept themselves. And sometimes their reaction when asked is very dramatic. It's surprising to themselves. You might hear an answer like, "Oh, I never thought about it," or "It never occurred to me," or "That's just the way it is in my religion." Adult children of addicts, they accept the dysfunctional religious messages as normal until somebody points out that it's not, that it was abusive, that it has created or contributed to these core guilt and shame issues, that it's blocked the patients in the grieving process and added to the guilt and to the loss. Dysfunctional religious messages really destroy our healthy sexuality. In The Road Less Traveled, M. Scott Peck jokingly says that he's a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and he says that the Catholic Church has provided him with a living. And he notes that he could easily substitute in that statement the Baptist Church or the Lutheran Church or the Presbyterian or any other churches. And he cites at length the case of Kathy, whose religious upbringing left her with such intense feelings of sin, especially in regard to her sexuality, that she resorted to hypnotic chanting to relieve her chronic fear that she was going to die. So in treating this patient, Dr. Peck had to constantly challenge those religious teachings that had really molded this woman's neuroses. Where did she learn that masturbation was a sin? Who told her it was a sin? How did the informant know it was a sin? What makes a sin? It really is a painstaking and sometimes very arduous task to unravel the threads of religious addiction and abuse from those knots of sexual dysfunction. And sometimes the abuse and the subsequent dysfunction are pretty easy to spot. Other times, the religious addiction is a lot more covert, and it's going to require you to be much more attuned to the symptoms and the hallmarks of the disease. It's most beneficial to all the patients to really treat religious addiction and abuse alongside other addictions. Religious addicts typically seek a way to feel superior and chosen and special. So separating them into in their own track only is going to enable that arrogance and that false sense of specialness to kind of flourish, and it serves only to further isolate them. So mainstreaming them with other patients really helps to break down those barriers. Patients frequently get in touch with these issues like incest and emotional abuse by hearing other patients share their experiences. So having religious addicts or victims of religious abuse working through their issues with a group of patients who maybe their addictions may vary can really help those patients to examine their own issues around religion. And it's also going to help those working through religious abuse issues to see that they're truly not alone. And a lot of religious addicts suffer from other compulsions and addictions, like eating disorders and sexual addiction. So these addictions are linked and they should be treated alongside each other. So when we talk about dual diagnosis, the traditional AA program really did a great disservice, and it kind of still does, by really putting down people who take antidepressants. And it makes them feel guilty and ashamed, as if they weren't really working a good enough 12-step program. This is also seen in some substance abuse treatment centers that, they often don't test alcoholics and addicts for organic depression. There are a lot of patients who suffer from clinical endogenous depression, and that hinders the effectiveness of their therapy and their ability to practice the 12-step program. Manic depressives especially have little or no emotional floor or ceiling, so their mood swings are so high and so low that just living on this emotional roller coaster is exhausting. And the struggle against the depression itself is really going to take so much energy that there's probably very little left to give to therapy or the 12-step groups. But with time and good therapy and the support found in the 12-step programs, many of those dually diagnosed patients eventually do work out of their organic depression, and they no longer need medication, or they may only need very low doses. And therapists and treatment teams need to really carefully evaluate those patients who may have clinical depression. Our psychiatric hospitals, they're really full of these deeply disturbed and sometimes psychotic patients who express their mania through religious obsession. And many psychiatrists see patients suffering from acute obsessive compulsive disorder, and those clients ritualize centers on religion. So, how then do we treat religious addiction alongside with those other addictions? What modifications, if any, should be made to the curriculum to accommodate issues of religious abuse? So, I said it before, so I'll repeat that many of you guys have nearly all the tools in place. It's merely a matter of placing them in context, of really addressing spirituality as being different from religion and focusing on the mental, emotional, and physical wellness that really promotes healthy spirituality. Most treatment centers typically will combine lectures, medical education, family therapy, and recreational therapy, as well as some individual and group therapy sessions. So lecture topics should address all of the obsessive compulsive behaviors, including religion. And if you teach the patients how to identify the symptoms of addiction, any addiction, they're more likely to recognize addictive behavior when they see it, no matter what substance or process is being abused. So I'm about to show you a treatment plan that really addresses the needs of those in the treatment center who have a religious addiction and abuse issues, among others. So let's start out with the lectures. You want to have a series of lectures on a variety of topics relating to addiction and compulsive behavior. And these should educate patients about the nature of addictions and begin to teach them how to recognize when they're behaving addictively or compulsively, no matter which substance or process they're abusing. So on the slide are some of the lecture topics that you might address. Next, you can use educational films. Religious addicts really benefit from seeing a mixture of educational videos and popular films. So they can view films like It Will Never Happen to Me or one of Father Leo Booth's videos on spirituality and recovery. Also in tandem with popular films like Nuts or Agnes of God or Elmer Gantry. These often serve as an effective means of getting patients in touch with those issues and feelings. You can also use nutrition or exercise programs. We want to keep in mind that a lot of religious addicts view their bodies as evil, and so they may have neglected or just outright abused themselves physically. So it's really important that they begin to change that thinking by learning to take better care of themselves. Some of these patients may have entered treatment for help with an eating disorder, so they're going to doubly benefit on the lectures on nutrition and exercise. Sexuality is frequently an issue as well. So I suggest a series of lectures or groups that focus on healthy sexuality and body image therapy. A lot of treatment centers use body movement work as a way to heal. So when used in combination with affirmations and journaling, body work and movement therapy can really help patients begin to enjoy their bodies and the feelings of sensuality. Writing a letter to their body is going to provide a really powerful tool in helping the patients begin to nurture and accept their bodies. And patients who are having sexual identity or sexual dysfunction problems can benefit from learning to open up that dialogue with their own, previously disowned parts, the needs and the feelings that they've tried to escape. And we can also incorporate spirituality groups. So careful distinction should be made from the outset that there is a difference between religion and spirituality. I've said it a bunch of times. The treatment team should also be aware that patients with religious abuse issues may react strongly to having chaplains and ministers or nuns or hospital outreach teams just arbitrarily visiting the unit. And we need to bear in mind that religiously abused patients might view ministers and priests and other, clergy or things like that in a negative light, kind of as perpetrators. And they're going to react very strongly, kind of as if you put a rapist in a room full of rape survivors. So it's recommended that you really limit the visits and services like these to patients who just request them. Some facilities have even discontinued the practice of placing Bibles in the bedside tables, and they no longer allow the religious tracts and the literature to be placed on the unit. And it's kind of disrespectful to those who are of different faiths or of no faith, and it's abusive to the religious abuse survivors, and it can be a trigger for the religious addicts. So the goal is to create an environment that really nurtures that healthy spirituality. So the day should start with a spirituality group that really focuses on developing self-love and self-acceptance. And the group should also encourage love and acceptance of others, especially those who come from different cultures and religions or from a non-religious background. Also be mindful of the fact that some patients may have religious addiction and abuse issues, and the meditation should be neutral and non-religious, taken perhaps maybe from one of the daily meditation books that are currently used by the 12-step groups. And then alternatively, a group leader may choose a theme like love or personal power or honesty, and have the patients describe the feelings that theme evokes and describe how it applies to their recovery. And this is going to open the door to connecting spirituality with the feelings, as well as stimulating creativity with the patient. And it also allows the patient to start to see how they can take responsibility for their recovery and for their personal development. And I also encourage the use of affirmations and really find them especially effective when the patients create their own, based on their own knowledge of their own needs and issues. I've listed some of these affirmations on the slide. I especially advocate journaling and using those letter writing techniques. These can be really effective tools for helping patients to recognize how they abuse themselves and thereby take the first steps towards self-acceptance and that reparenting that's necessary. And as patients start to explore their addictions and their guilt and their shame, they should be encouraged to write about those early religious messages. And this is going to help you to identify which patients might have religious addiction and abuse issues. And it helps them to get in touch with sources of shame that they may not previously have considered. Some of the questions they could cover, I've put them on the slide. So basically what you're looking for is a worldview that's described by M. Scott Peck as so essential to identifying and diagnosing issues and compulsions. Cognitive group therapy can then focus on helping the patients gain insight into how these messages and beliefs shaped their self-image and led to addictions. You can challenge that black and white, non-critical thinking. This questioning sets off really powerful emotions. The idea that we have choices, that we can be responsible for our spirituality, that we can recreate our image of God as a partner and a guide. It can be really explosive when heard for the first time. So many of these treatment methods that I described already are often used in conjunction with inner child play, which has really become a vital part of many treatment programs. And it just seems to be a matter of course in many of the workshops these days for participants to be handed paper and crayons and invited to draw or color some sort of childhood experience and feeling. And this works especially well with the use of writing and drawing with the non-dominant hand. Have patients draw their earliest image of God. Ask them to dialogue with that image. Where did it come from? Did they acquire it through formal religious education, or was it absorbed from watching parental behavior or from playmates? And then you might want to have the patients draw their current image of God. Most people still see God the way they did as a small child, just as they carry many other childhood assumptions and beliefs with them as adults. You might also have them draw the image of God that they would like to have if they were inventing God all over again. And this really works well with patients who are preparing to let go of their old God. And there are several guided visualizations that ask people to journey to their childhood bedrooms and their houses. And these are easily adapted to help find the origins of this religious guilt or shame or fear. And in the visualizations that ask them to look at their earliest feelings about their parents, you can have them invite God into the room and thus begin dialoguing with the dysfunctional beliefs. Be creative. The more imaginative you are in adapting or devising tools for inner child work, the more you begin to teach patients how to discover their own creativity. And in the process, you're going to bring them closer to this healthy, whole spirituality and a happy co-creatorship with God. Religious addicts, they're usually going to profoundly affect their families. So if possible, it's important for family members or significant others to really be involved in the treatment. We want to remember that many religious addicts are children of religious addicts, or they may have children of their own. In these cases, the parents and the children need to be included in the family therapy. Communication and the setting of boundaries is really important, especially if the family's been forced to attend church with the addict or has been routinely subjected to the addict's obsessive behavior. Family members, particularly those who want to attend a different church or maybe none at all, they have to be permitted to set boundaries concerning their own religious expression and growth. While the religious addict is, responsible for defining what their abstinence will look like, family members may have boundaries they might wish to set concerning respect for their beliefs. So teaching the family members to express their feelings healthily will be the biggest challenge, obviously. No doubt the family members will, probably in self-defense, have acquired many of the guilt and the shame and the blame tactics that are employed by the addict. So they're going to need many sessions to learn to disengage from the dogmatism or the scripture quoting and the proselytizing. They need to learn to remind the addict gently but firmly of those particular boundaries that they may have set and to state the need to have that boundary respected. Some may even find it beneficial to be a little bit confrontational. So, for example, saying, "Mom, you're quoting scripture again. Are you trying to tell me how you feel about this subject?" So, in time, each family is going to find its own method of healthy communication. And I really encourage family counseling on a regular basis, at least once a month, if not more, for a good 6 months following treatment, and longer if the abuse was extremely severe. It's going to be especially helpful if religious addicts and religious codependents attend outside 12-step support groups with other patients. Again, the likelihood of multiple addictions makes it pretty probable that patients are going to need to attend 12-step groups for codependency or substance abuse, eating disorders, as well as sexual addiction and incest survivor groups. Being among people who share similar feelings, regardless of the substance or the process that was abused, it really helps to end that sense of isolation and being different. Others in those meetings might also benefit from hearing the experiences of the religious addicts and the religious codependents. There's no specific groups for the religious addicts and their codependents. Sending an addict and a family member to the relevant 12-step support groups is really going to be of the most help. If there's enough interest, the treatment center that you work for might begin, to facilitate these types of support groups. And lastly, but certainly not least, treatment for religious addiction must include ongoing support. As more people begin to talk about their religious addiction and abuse in other 12-step meetings, they may find a nucleus from which to form their own Religious Addicts Anonymous, or maybe even Religious Codependents Anonymous. And a lot of patients may have been treated for years for some of these symptoms, In most cases, these patients make some progress if their related addictions are addressed. I don't believe any religious addict can build a strong recovery if the religiosity is not identified and addressed as its own disease. Treating the symptoms is rather like putting salve on boils that are caused by a virus. Until you treat the virus, the boils are going to keep coming back, and so will the patients, time and time again, in relapse, until their religious addiction is treated. That bedrock of shame remains untouched until those religious issues are addressed. And as more of you begin to identify and treat religious addiction, I hope that you're going to begin to start networking with one another.